Okay. Hi, folks, and welcome to Ancient Medicine, uh, the online version. I hope this finds you well and that you're taking care of your families and practicing good social distancing etiquette, and that you're being prudent as prudent can be. So here is some stuff to take your mind off the pandemic. Not very far off your mind, but, a little bit. So let me see if I can turn off my floating head. You've seen me. Hi. All right, we're done. And now we're just going to talk. Before we get to Galen, I want to pause for a minute and go through our Roman authors so far, something that tends to cause confusion, especially as we're looking down the barrel of the midterm, is which authors we've read are Greek and which authors we've read are Roman. That's puzzling a bit because it's also unclear sometimes. As soon as Romans are interacting with Greeks, there's a lot of crossover, a lot of intersectional identities. But here are our authors for the Roman section of the course. We start with Cato the Elder, who, well, is the elder, but also the eldest of our Roman and Latin language authors here. He lives from 234 to 149 BCE, and he wrote De Agricultura, the didactic poem that is like a teaching poem on agriculture. Why, you may ask, are we reading a book about agriculture for medicine? Well, Cato represents this kind of Roman medicine that existed before the widespread adoption of Greek-style medicine and Greek-style doctors. This isn't to say that he wasn't aware of Greeks. Cato went to college in Athens, as did his son. He knew of the Hippocratic corpus and had a handle on what Greek medicine could have to offer. His big political push was to insist that Romans speak Latin and that Romans maintain a distance from Greek culture, Greek research, and Greek knowledge. To that end, his On Agriculture includes both advice for how to farm your land with enslaved labor and also medical advice that represents Italian folk medicine and the kind of stuff that folks were using before upper-class Romans began to read medical authors and to hire Roman, or rather Greek-speaking doctors. Traditionally speaking, it was the male head of household, the pater familias's duty to oversee health care for his family. Family here isn't just people who are related to you, it's you, your enslaved folks, your freedmen, everybody except your wife most of the time. Your wife belonged to her father's family. All right, so that's Cato. If you're trying to place his content in your mind, this is the fellow who's very fond of cabbage. This is an ancient portrait bust, the image on this slide of some Roman guy. We don't have a firm identification, but it's often listed as a portrait of Cato the Elder, however, probably not. But he looks like you'd expect Cato to look, which is, I think, why that's gotten to be a bit of a thing. Below also, some astute internet person photoshopped him into a cabbage, which is hilarious if you've done the reading. So if you haven't, treat yourself, because Cato has some very interesting advice. I think we mentioned this last time we met as a class. This is stick up your butt to prevent chub rub guy. Next up, a good century later, really 150 years, we have Aulus Cornelius Celsus. We don't know a ton about this author other than this reading existing and his name and the authorship. We're not even sure if his first name is Aulus, but we'll just go with that. Celsus, sometimes you'll hear him pronounced Celsus. I prefer the hard C, that's how it works in Latin. The De Medicina, his On Medicine, was part of a 4-volume series on the sciences in the ancient world. military science, agricultural science, and I think another one was on rhetoric, and then the on medicine. Now, the other three have been lost. The only thing we have left from Celsus is his on medicine, because it's just so gosh darn useful. Although Celsus is a Latin speaker, he's writing in Latin, he likely identified as Roman. The scholarship he's using to write his on medicine is pulled from Alexandrian research and authors. He's one of our main sources for Herophilus and Erasistratus, and the kinds of surgical procedures he describes seem to have their basis in surgical research in Alexandria. It was a classic for ages. It's never been out of print. This was the go-to surgical manual of the Middle Ages, both in the Latin and the Arab-speaking worlds. It's a super influential book. We're not going to be spending as much time with it now. We're instead going to focus on Celsus when we talk about surgery in the ancient world. But this is a useful timeline, so I'm putting him in here. Slightly, by 2 years, younger than Celsus is Pliny the Elder, who is my ancient best friend. I love this guy so much, and you'll have to pardon me because I have a hard time not talking about him too much. So Pliny the Elder is the author of many works, only one of which survives. His earliest work was on cavalry tactics. He wrote a grammar manual, some history works, but this that we're going to visit with a bit in this class is his most impressive contribution to scientific writing, and it is huge. There's no way we can read even a fraction of his natural history because it's 37 books long, and these books are very long books. Just to give you some perspective, Pliny the Elder still takes up an entire shelf on the library if you go to see him in the Kuhn Library. Don't, though, because social distancing is important. Also, Pliny the Elder is available on the internet. If you Google him and ignore all of the beer ads, you'll run into him. There's a beer named after him, by the way, and if you Google him, you'll see that too. Pliny the Elder doesn't give us beer recipes. What he does is he maybe possibly mentions hops once, sort of. It's a really tenuous connection, but it's a fancy craft beer. I hear folks like it. I have a sulfite allergy, so beer and I are a no-go. What you should remember Pliny the Elder for is that he is a nerd hero. He had an active military career until the reign of Nero, who, amongst the many reasons to hate him because he was just a shitty human being and not a particularly good governor either, the Emperor Nero decided that Pliny the Elder and his circle of military officials were not trustworthy, probably sketchy, and maybe plotting against him. So Pliny had to take a hiatus from his military service, and that might have been when he started writing the natural history, although the first thing he writes and publishes during this period is his work on grammar. He served with Corbulo and perhaps also Vespasian. We do know that he and Vespasian were very close, so that when Vespasian overthrows Nero, more or less, it's complicated. Look up the Year of Four Emperors if you're interested in how this pans out. Pliny the Elder's dude and army buddy, Vespasian, got to be emperor, and then Pliny was called back to service. In 79 CE, the year that he died, he was stationed at the Bay of Naples. The Roman naval base in Misenum was the major naval base defending Rome. Rome's own port, Ostia, wasn't able to handle the kind of deep draft boats that you would need, so they put that in the Bay of Naples. To be the commander in Misenum is a massive honor. Pliny, if you asked him to describe his life's work among friends, he'd probably mention the military service first. So it is still more remarkable that while he was commanding the largest and most important naval base in the Roman world, he also worked in all of his spare time on the natural history, which is what we'll be reading bits of. The natural history was his attempt to give you a one-stop shop for the state-of-the-art of scientific knowledge in the 1st century CE. And he read just an amazing amount of literature for his literature review. And unlike many ancient authors, he cites his sources pretty reliably. Because of Pliny the Elder, we have preserved bits and pieces from scientists that otherwise would be lost. One of them is Juba of Mauritania. Mauritania's modern Morocco. He was an African king allied with Rome, and also he married Cleopatra's daughter, Cleopatra Selene. So he's super interesting, if only for that. But he too was a scientific author and politician, like most Hellenistic kings. He wrote on animal behavior, especially that of the elephant, mapping, and geography. And the only reason we know that Juba wrote anything is that he's in Pliny the Elder. Similarly, most of the women authors we have from the ancient world, we have because Pliny the Elder used them in his research and cited his sources. This includes Laius, Elephantis, Cleopatra the pharmacologist. Cleopatra is a really common woman's name in Greek. And Soter the physician, Matrodora the gynecologist. If it weren't for Pliny the Elder, we wouldn't even know these women's names. So the fact that this book exists is our last link to the many, like not a huge number, but there is a pretty decent amount of women scientists in the ancient world, which is so cool, amongst all the other things that are cool about Pliny the Elder. But he himself did a little bit of first-hand poking around. Anytime he was stationed anywhere in the empire, he took notes and used it to evaluate his sources. So he's a researcher too. Now, the only way he was able to write this massive work while simultaneously holding down a full-time job, and also he had a career on the side as a logger. Like, this guy was a machine, but also, and here's where it gets a little less wholesome, he had a large enslaved secretarial pool. So what you're reading is not just Pliny the Elder's writing, but it's a collaboration between Pliny and a sizable staff, and we know this because his nephew and heir wrote a description of his working methods. So this is one of the only authors in the ancient world for whom we know their research process. So what he'd do is, whenever he had a spare moment, when he was traveling, when he was waiting for court cases to come out of recess, when he was in the bath, when he was eating dinner, when he was up in the middle of the night, he had really bad insomnia. Then he would have one of his enslaved secretaries read to him, and then he'd have another secretary there to take his notes while he's reading, and then this would create this bank of notes, and then he'd work on it later with his secretarial pool to collate, compile, and put it into a whole. So the result of this collaboration, the natural history, goes from the shape of the cosmos and the sky through man as an animal to all of the other animals. Pliny has this idea that human beings aren't separate from the rest of the animal kingdom, that we're an animal too, and this means that animals have souls and personalities and habits and culture. He's just a delightful observer of that. He also writes on, let's see, geography, astronomy, mineralogy, geology, natural phenomena, and then book after book after book after book on remedies. Now, a casual acquaintance with Pliny the Elder will suggest that he was just a shitty medical scientist. He does record a lot of cures that are pretty out there. For instance, there's this one place where he says rabid dog bites can be cured with roses. No, that's not how you cure rabies. He also suggests that if you apply an ointment to the rabid dog bite, made from a hair of the tail of the dog that bit you, which is where we get the phrase hair of the dog, is from Pliny's rabies cure. This isn't a great rabies cure. However, he spends a lot of time talking about unscrupulous alternative medicine and magical cures. He pushes back really hard at the magi, particularly, but also for medical practitioners who charge unreasonable fees and use their position of trust to financially abuse their patients. So he's one of the first advocates for affordable and accessible healthcare. And he's also really interested in educating his reader about good science and good medicine. How do you know a good cure? He is passionately committed to giving you cures that are affordable, accessible, and that work not just for educated elite Romans, but for anyone. And a lot of the medical information he gives you is meant to keep you from being taken in by predatory doctors. Now, this doesn't mean that Pliny the Elder is super woke. He's an ancient Roman. There are limits. And he was a pretty committed imperialist. But he's also one of the oldest writers to passionately argue for environmental sustainability. Ecology shows up everywhere in the natural history. He talks about soil depletion, the loss of foresting, irresponsible agricultural processes, littering, toxicity, waste, mine refuse. And he's also very adamant that human lives shouldn't be expended in the search for resources. He talks a lot about the ethics of buying pearls when pearl farmers regularly died from diving to get the oysters from the bottom of the seabed. He wrote about mine safety and miners' lives. He's an early advocate not just for workers' rights, but also for affordable healthcare and environmental sustainability. I love this guy, while being horrified at the whole, owning enslaved people thing. And not so much on board with the imperialism thing, but, ancient people are problematic. Now, this in and of itself is sufficient reason to find Pliny the Elder just a fantastic source and a great person. But he also had the best death in the ancient world. So, AD 79, in Misenum, that's the Bay of Naples. Naples, Italy, is also where Pompeii and Herculaneum are. You see where I'm going with this. So, one day in 79, the date is debated, so I won't pin it down, either in August or September, depending. Mount Vesuvius went from being a mountain to being a topless ash cloud blower. We know this from Pliny's nephew. He was 17 at the time, and he was staying with his uncle and his mom, Pliny's sister Plinia. Pliny the Elder himself never married and never had a romantic partner as far as we know. He had no biological children, which is why he adopted his nephew as his heir. So, as well as being a geek icon, Pliny the Elder might also be an early asexuality icon, too. He's my ancient best friend. You'll just have to forgive me. Actually, don't. Pliny is awesome. Anyway, 79. Vesuvius blows its top. Pliny goes to the window, sees the eruption in progress, and he starts making plans to go check it out from a closer angle. He asks his nephew if his nephew wants to come with, and then Pliny the Younger tells his uncle, yeah, I'd love to, but I've got to do my homework, so I'm going to stay here. Bless his heart. Now, about this time, Pliny starts getting messages from panicked citizens along the coast in the Bay of Naples begging for rescue. And at this point, Pliny's scientific mission now turns into a rescue mission. He calls up the ships at Misenum, including his flagship, and he organizes very quickly a party to sail across the Bay of Naples to Stabii, which is the closest port to Pompeii and Herculaneum and other towns around the bay, partly to save his friend, I think her name is Rutilia or something, his other friend Pomponianus meets him at the beach. Pomponianus had a library, so Pliny wants to rescue people, but he's also in rescuing the libraries of Pompeii, because this was a wealthy playground for a lot of Roman civil servants like Pliny, and he knew where all the good books were and was really worried that they'd get hurt in the eruption. Now, once they arrive at Stabia, they realize that the prevailing winds are blowing inshore. So while it was very easy to sail towards the eruption, sailing away from the eruption is much more difficult. By now, ash is falling on the boats. They have to continuously move it off of the decks so that the boats don't sink. So what Pliny does at this point, when he sailed, he told his men, "Fortune favors the brave, let's go." He now can't leave, so he stays the night at his friend Pomponianus's house while serving as the nerve center of the rescue operation. So people are being loaded onto the boats, he's preparing for the winds to shift, and if not, because these Roman warships can be moved by oars, then he's going to row out. Now, on the next day, as the refugees were climbing onto the boat, including Pliny, he collapses because he himself had chronic underlying health conditions. He was one of the people who was particularly vulnerable in an eruption, or indeed in any other kind of disaster scenario. So he has an asthma attack. He may have also had a heart attack secondary to the asthma attack. Other people were still able to breathe, so it wasn't toxic fumes at the same level that killed people, say, on the beach at Herculaneum. So Pliny tries to make it to the boat. Two of his aides try to hold him up, but he's just overcome, and they leave him on the beach so as to save his space for more of the evacuees from Pompeii. They come back later, and they see that his body's still there on the beach, almost like it's sleeping, but he's gone, he's dead. Side note about this, you may have seen news items popping up about whether or not we've discovered the skull of Pliny the Elder. It's probably not Pliny the Elder's skull, and I'm so sorry. I really want it to be. I'm that kind of a fangirl. I would just love to have it, but because the body was found by his nephew, it's inconceivable, well, almost inconceivable, that his nephew would leave the body there and not take it home and bury it. Like, that would have been an actionable faux pas that no self-respecting Roman would do. It's not how they roll. And that's the death of Pliny the Elder. Now, it's not quite the end, though, because this kind of eruption that happened at Vesuvius, where you have a sudden explosion and a cloud that hangs in the air and subsequently collapses in a pyroclastic flow, it wasn't that Romans didn't know that volcanoes existed and that eruptions happen. Like, Stromboli's right there in Sicily. They've seen volcanoes, but they didn't know that this kind of volcano existed, one that suddenly explodes after periods of dormancy. This kind of eruption had a name, and we still call it a Plinian eruption, after Pliny the Elder and also his nephew Pliny the Younger, who wrote down an account of the incident. And that's Pliny the Elder. He's a geek icon, a science hero, and one of the most delightfully wholesome authors to come out of the ancient world. I love him to death. He's fantastic. No, I'm not overselling this. You should totally treat yourself to Pliny. Okay. On to our next author. That's Galen of Pergamum. I'm not nearly as much of a scholar fangirl for Galen as I am for Pliny, but Galen also deserves your respect and attention because he is, among all of these names, except for maybe Pliny, the most influential to come out of this lineup. Now, about a century or so after Pliny the Elder was active, Galen of Pergamum becomes the physician to the emperor, then Marcus Aurelius. we'll be talking about him today. He's the actual topic of this lecture. More about him coming up, but the treatise I'm having you read for this week to get to know Galen is On Prognosis. On Prognosis is going to make for a better read if you keep in mind that ancient literature, like Galen's, was meant to be performed. So it's like looking at the transcript of somebody's podcast or poetry slam. It's meant also to be a little bit of an infomercial, because the thing that starts happening in medicine under the Roman Empire is that doctors compete for who gets to be the physician to the most powerful Roman. And they do this by actively competing with each other in public demonstrations, and also by having intellectual debates and dogfights, really, at the bedside of sick Roman dudes. More about that later. We've also read something else from the Roman period. The Digest of Roman Law is the source that I got the things we were reading when we were talking about the doctrine Roman law. Now, those laws date from the 1st century BC to the 3rd century CE. It's a really wide spread. It was compiled in 533 CE in an attempt to standardize Roman law. And if you remember anything from Law Day, you can see why they might need some standardization. So the internally contradictory Roman laws we were reading are after they tried to make everything consistent, which gives you some idea of just how chaotic the Roman legal system could be. And that's that. So on to the specifics for Galen.